10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn.
Borodar Pab, Croeso i Abertawe. Hello and welcome to Swansea, the Twilight Show on Teachers Talk Radio with me, Nathan Gynn. Tonight, we're joined by Ian Timbrell, teacher, deputy head and consultant. We're talking about getting them to start. What do you do when they just won't work? Barriers, task design, motivation, all of these things. Tune in, talk it out. Off we go.
Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Borodar Pab, Croeso i Abertawe. Hello and welcome to Swansea and Teachers Talk Radio Twilight Show with me, Nathan Gynn. Now, as I said in the intro there, I'm hoping we're joined by Ian Timbrell. Ian, are you on the line there?
I am indeed. How are you, Nathan?
I'm good, thanks. And it's great to have you. Now, normally at the start of the show, I talk a little bit. I should mention again this week, it is not Twilight when we're doing the Twilight Show. I get a window twice a year where it's actually twilight when we're doing the Twilight Show. It's still dark and it's still miserable. I've got a bit of a cough, bit of a cold. Everyone at work seems to be coming down with something. How are you doing, Ian?
Yes, good, thank you. I mean, we had in Wales St. Dwynwen's Day last night, which is the Welsh St. Valentine's Day. So there were a few wines had last night. So, but all good, all good.
Fantastic. Yep, of course, yourself in Wales. I'm in Swansea. You're down the road in Cardiff, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, I've lived in Cardiff most of my life, to be honest. I'm originally from Bridgend. My parents didn't want me to go far, though. So half an hour down the road is all that they would let me go to uni.
We cram a lot in along the M4 corridor. We cram lot in South Wales. There's a lot going on down here. We got rushing into things, but I think let's set the scene. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I have been in education for about 17 years in and around the South Wales valleys. I mean, my plan was actually, those who know me know I never intended to be a teacher. I was actually going to be a doctor originally, and that didn't quite pan out. But I've been teaching for 17 years. For the last 5, I've been a deputy head in a primary school, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. But those who follow me on Twitter will know that I've actually taken a break from teaching at the moment to set up my own education consultancy, which has been a baptism of fire the last 2 weeks. I've only been in it 2 weeks. It's been really enjoyable and getting to see lots of schools. But I love challenging children. I love, when there's those children who surprise you. That's what for me makes teaching, is those children who've got so much going on in their life and they struggle. If we can get them to achieve something, those are always my favorite days in school.
Well, fantastic. Well, that is pretty much every day for me. For my sins, working in alternative provision, is some of those challenges. And that's why I find, one of the questions we're talking about, we're going to talk about, really, really interesting. And as I say, we're going to be talking about this idea of getting them to start, when they're right at the beginning. And I've heard this a lot, and I'm going to put it out to you. People saying things like, whether it be in the corridor, car park, someone comes up to you and says, getting work out of my class is like pulling teeth. It's that kind of thing. Now, so before we start, is that something you've heard, you relate to, you recognise?
Yeah, I've heard it my entire career, and and it's from such a huge range of teachers. NQTs, ECTs, experienced members of staff, deputy heads of department. I think, I've heard it a lot of different places. And I find it really interesting to sort of, you give that phrase, like getting work out of them is the bit I personally find interesting, because we shouldn't be getting work out of children. It's not already in there. We should be doing that work collaboratively together. And I do find it interesting. And I'm going to look forward actually to breaking that down quite a bit of, in my experience, how have I tackled one, that the attitude of that, but also in reality in the classroom, what do we need to do to get children to do work?
And I wanted to ask just, a couple of probing questions, personal questions. You can say no, but I'm sure listeners will find them interesting. I find them interesting just to kind of get like an understanding of the man behind the teacher, as it were. But you said you weren't going to be a teacher. You went into primary rather than secondary. Was that a deliberate choice?
It was. I basically was made redundant from a job I was in that I did after I left medical school, and I happened to be working behind a bar, and one of my dad's friends was the head and said, "Oh, come on, we need people to read in the school." So I went in, and I just absolutely fell in love with the job straight away. And I sort of was toying between primary or secondary maths, because I'm a maths geek. I love maths. But I honestly don't. It was literally down to the wire of which one I was going to go for. And I think because I'd had that experience in primary school, I really enjoyed that. That's why I went into primary, I think. Also, I had quite a poor experience of secondary school. I don't have good memories at all of secondary school. And that probably sort of had some sort of bearing on it.
And also, interesting. People might not realize as a man, I was also in primary myself. But was it mentioned to you being a man in primary? Was there any sort of distinction between that you were maybe, I don't know, stricter, or you got work out of them more, or that you were unique in any way?
Wherever I've been in schools, I've been seen as the person who you come to for discipline and for getting children to work. And I don't know whether that's because I'm a man necessarily. I wonder if it's just my general manner. But I do think there is, in some schools, a default to the man as the person with discipline if children aren't doing what they should be doing. I think I see it less and less now. I think we are, as a society, moving away from those sort of stereotypes and those gender stereotypes. I've definitely seen it in some places. I see it more in sense of responsibilities that are given to people. We know that certainly in primary, there are a lot more men in leadership positions, and yet there's more women in teaching in primary in general. So I do find that interesting, that there's still that difference when you go up to leadership positions.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I know, I just probing a little bit, but I do find these kind of nuances different, and there will be people listening from different sectors, different sort of areas. And so, these kind of interesting bits and pieces of just people's experience of teaching. It's such a broad spectrum. Now, I wanted to throw in as well, sort of at the start, as we get started, as I say, I put out a couple of things on Twitter, just kind of asking, probing, and I know you were kind enough to respond to one of them. But one of the criticisms that some people had with the scenario I put out, that one about sort of getting work out of my classes like pulling teeth, was the whole class phrasing, and people saying, it can't be all of the pupils. But personally, I've had lessons where it is all of the pupils, absolute car crashes. And I think that's part of teaching. For me, having bad lessons is part of teaching, at least, and reflecting on them. But, we're going to be talking about how to do better. But how hard do you, as sort of a leader, a teacher, think teachers should be being on themselves to get it right?
I think there is an expectation. You cannot be an outstanding teacher in every single lesson you do. It's not the reality of it. We all have those disaster lessons that just, they don't go as planned. The work is not challenging enough, or it's too challenging, or the behavior isn't there, or just the way you live out. And I think as a profession, we need to embrace those mistakes and actually go, that's fine. Do you know what? That lesson was a disaster, but what have I learned from it? I'll try not to make that mistake again. And I very much, when I'm supporting sort of newly qualified teachers, go telling them that don't beat yourself up about a bad lesson, just analyze it and learn from it. And sometimes I think I've seen so many lessons over the years where, particularly students and new qualified teachers, a lesson is going down the pan, and they keep going, don't they? And they keep going and keep going. Actually what they need to do is go, right, everyone stop, this isn't working, let's change the plan. And it's very hard to do when someone's observing you, isn't it? It's easier said than done sometimes. But I think we need to embrace those mistakes and actually go, do you know what? It's a learning experience.
Yeah, and so we'll be talking about some of those things and some of these refining and bits and pieces. And the other bit I wanted to kind of just throw out there in our very sort of starting off, feeling out the topic. And as you said, we're going to get a bit more break it down as we go. One of the other things that I put out, which I was thinking about barriers, and maybe this will give people maybe a breakdown of the kind of things that we might be talking about if they're listening in. And this was specifically about writing. And when I was talking about writing, maybe this is the primary school teacher in me, I was thinking about in foundation subjects as well. So, like doing writing in geography, doing writing in history. I don't know if people took it that way. They might have just thought it was about English. I don't know. But I put out 4 different kind of criteria. And I'm going to read through the ones that I said. I said confidence, ideas, understand the outcome, and spelling and grammar. So this is that idea of putting pen to paper and a written outcome. So I guess I'm excluding maths here, but that was kind of my feeling on it. And they came back and they were all fairly even, apart from understand the outcome, and that was only at 7%. The rest of them are in the 30s coming back. Does that sort of surprise you? Is there anything you would add to that list that you think are sort of barriers to? And I'm saying writing, but in my head, I'm thinking primary across all subjects.
I'm surprised that outcome isn't higher because, we talk all the time, if you look at any research, that purpose and audience and those things in writing are so important. Because what I try to say when I'm teaching about writing to teachers is going, well, you never actually... When you're writing an email, you know what the purpose of the email is, or if you're writing a letter or whatever, I think there is a tendency that some people have to go, oh, well, I just need to write a diary and a very tick box exercise. But you need to know what the outcome is. You need to know where it's going, who's going to read it, because that then will craft the writing, or should craft the writing. So I am surprised that was there. I think ideas is a massive one. And I think that comes down to lots of life experience. And many of our children who struggle because they haven't got those life experiences. It's why I've got a bit of an issue with cold writes. I like lukewarm writes, where, you do need to do assessment pieces, but actually that ideas bit, we need to give them those ideas. How on earth are they going to put onto paper if they've had no experience of things? And I was surprised how high grammar and spelling was. Now, I'm a massive grammar nerd. I love grammar. I've got a master's in grammar as well. And I was surprised how high that was. To me, that's the least important of them all. At the end of the day, if someone can read your writing, that's the main thing. You don't have to have perfect grammar and spelling. And there's no such thing as perfect grammar anyway. So I was surprised, about the arrangement of them, to be honest. I'd be interested. I'd love to dig down into people who didn't choose outcome. I'd love to know why.
I was equally, it really shocked me. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it's my wording of it, but outcome, or what you're doing it to make it look like, was always often such a, when I was a teacher, drilled into me. And it was of the time when waggles were becoming really popular. For those of you who haven't taught in primary or haven't come across them, is what a good one looks like. So waggle, and you'd be showing a waggle of it, and exemplars maybe we talk about more at secondary now, and so they know where they're getting to, or model answers, maybe all of those things was so drilled into me that was something they needed, that it really surprised me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, modeling is so important, and seeing a final product is so important, because for some children, they can't envisage the final product. And so what happens then is they're just sort of drifting along through the learning journey, not really knowing where they're going. Because for some children, let's say newspaper writing, for example, how many children have actually read a newspaper? Like, probably none. I argue that genre should go, and it should be replaced with like online newspapers, because that's what they read. They read news online, and they never pick up a paper. But actually, we have to show them an example. And I find it interesting when people are like, oh no, I can't show them an example of the one we're going to do because they'll just copy it. They won't copy it. I mean, if they've got a good enough memory to actually copy it, that's quite impressive if you're writing for 2 weeks. So I never fear about showing them a model. I always would, because those children need to be able to see what they're doing and where the end journey is going to be.
Now, we've talked a little bit about, sort of some of the bits and pieces in the introduction here to talk about, we talked a little bit about yourself, where you've come from, your journey. I wanted to kind of set out the stall as well for our listeners. Obviously, if you're listening in live in the Podbean app, you can text us in, you can message. So if you have questions, if you want to join the conversation, you can use that little text feature to message the studio live. You can also tweet us at TT Radio Official, and I'll pick those up and we'll read them out if you want to do it that way. You can always call in if you're feeling brave enough. There is a little button and you're listening on your phone. You can click that. You'll be able to call in and join the conversation to kind of ask or share your ideas or share your kind of tips for getting them started. Now, the last kind of bit that I want to throw before we really start unpicking is, in my head, and maybe this is me, maybe this is my experience. Lovely there. Hi, we've got a listener there from Iran listening in. Great to have you with us. And I can see Pat's joined us as well. Now, in my head, when I was talking about struggling to get started, it was writing. Okay, that was the bit that I had in my mind. And as I expand that, I started to think, okay, maybe art as well. I've come across this in a little bit in maths. Do you think there are sort of subjects where this is more likely, you're likely to see that kid frozen, sort of not knowing how to get themselves started?
Yeah, oh, definitely. And I think it depends what their barriers are. I think there can be an issue in some classes, unfortunately, with some children who don't want to do any work, and that can come down to confidence, and we'll explore that in a bit. But I think that certain subjects have stigmas. So mine one was in school was art. I hated art in school. I laugh in my class because I say I can't draw a stick man with that stencil. And I always hated it because I knew that what I was going to produce was so much worse than everyone else's. And actually, what my teachers didn't do was encourage me or support me. I was just getting roused for not starting on time. And I think, there can be issues with maths, for example. If a child has poor basic number skills, they're not going to want to start doing calculations because it's really hard work. If they're still, not able to, say, use near doubles, for example, doing more complex things is going to be a nightmare. So sometimes it's not necessarily the thing they're going to do there. There can be stories around it, gaps they've got, issues, their past experiences. And it can be quite difficult to unpick sometimes, I think, why. But certainly, I think, for me, the subject to say it most of all is writing, if I'm honest. It is that subject that lots of people struggle with.
We've just had a message in there from Pat, who's just said, I teach DT and engineering. Some students freeze at first, but I make it problem solving and fun. Fantastic. I really like that as a comment, but also I agree there, Pat. When I think about particularly in my sort of primary DT, and we had to do that element where they maybe have to do multiple designs of a product, or we say like, okay, we're going to design something, and I think you've touched on it already in about them maybe not having experience of it. If they've only seen one calculator, us designing 6 different calculators to choose the best design was always an absolute nightmare for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great, Pat. I enjoyed DT in school, actually, and I think for that reason that you were given enough freedom, but within safety confines. You were given the guidelines, but actually you could go on your own track. And I think sometimes as well, we can be too restrictive for them. Actually, let's get the balance between, they need to be creative, but within some confines and guidelines so we can help them through it. And I think it sounds great, Pat, and love to see some of the work you've done.
Now, we did say we were going to really start unpicking this topic because it sounds like a small thing, and then when I started kind of, trying to pull this apart, it's there's a lot to get on with. But before we really get into it, it is time for a quick shout out to one of our sponsors, who are a great organisation, John Catt Education, who produce educational books. We're just going to hear a little from them before we start.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
Live from Swansea, this is The Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Borrowed pal, croeso I Abertawe. Hello everyone, welcome to Swansea and the Twilight Show here on Teachers Talk Radio. With me, Nathan Gynn. I'm joined by Ian Timbrell, teacher, deputy head, consultant. We're talking about getting them to start. What do you do when they just won't work? And we're talking specifically that kind of first moment of freezing. As one of our listeners has said, when the task is put in front of them, that paper is there, the blank sheet, and they're looking at it. Ian, I should say as well, having someone who understands Welsh. You haven't yet corrected me on saying Borodar. Sort of every time in my introduction, I do apologise.
I didn't want to say. I was like, Noswaithar. It's one of those things when people are learning Welsh very much. It's knowing when to correct, isn't it? Because I'm partially fluent, but my son is fluent. My son goes to Welsh medium school, so he speaks Welsh all day, and he loves correcting me. I have to say, he loves telling me when I'm doing it wrong.
Do you know what? Every time when I get to speak to someone from Wales who has an understanding of the Welsh language, and I kind of go, look, it's the most known one. I could use the correct one for the time of day, but it's the most known one, and so we'll go with that for now. But it's my touch to curriculum Gymraeg that I'm still trying to push out there, very exciting. So your son goes to a Welsh language school, then, did you say?
He does, yeah. He so his other dad is fluent Welsh and went to Welsh school, and when we adopted him, we very much made that decision that we wanted him to go to Welsh medium, and it's fascinating. This child started school at age 3 with no Welsh words, and within about 3 or 4 weeks was coming home and able to have conversations. It's an absolute incredible thing.
Does that leave you out sometimes? Do they, sort of have their own Welsh conversation? Are you able to keep up?
No. That's the that's the quick answer. I went to Welsh lessons when he started school, and it used to frustrate me because it would take me 3 weeks to remember some words or phrases, and he was picking up new words every day. The plasticity of a young brain, and it is hard sometimes, and I can have conversations and things, but yes, sometimes, if I'm watching Welsh language TV, I have to have the subtitles on because I can't follow quick enough. And I think sometimes he does enjoy that I don't understand. It's a 9-year-old getting to that age now where I'm sure he's going to be talking about me in Welsh, knowing I can't understand certain things.
Oh, you're just under his breath, just a couple.
Yeah.
Little Welsh words. No, I'm lucky enough to have 2 sons myself, and when I moved back to South Wales, I have one who learned to speak in England and has my accent, a kind of Southern English kind of estuary accent. But then my youngest son, who has learned to speak here, has got a proper Welsh accent. And I keep saying, if I can get him on a rugby team, I'm going to get him on rugby teams, and then I'm going to have one play for England, one play for Wales. If there's a World Cup final I can get him into, then I think there's film rights. I think I can get film rights for that, and I will be a rich and happy and proud father with one Welsh, one English, sort of head to head. Right. Anyway, we digress. Sorry, digressing a little bit, talking about children. We were talking about getting them to start learning, pencil to paper, all of those things. And I wanted to ask, first of all, in my wording, when I phrased it of getting work out of them, my class is like pulling teeth, and you've kind of already picked up on this. We're going to start off with the smallest aspect, I guess, what seems small, which is the work they're doing, and talking about sort of that idea of task completion, and is it the same as learning? What's your take on that?
I refer to that sort of task completion as doing stuff. So are they just doing stuff, or are they learning? It's that big difference between, say, for example, now if we're talking about speaking and listening, are they just doing speaking and listening, or are they learning how to speak and listen? And I think, certainly, when people start their career, some people, I think, find it difficult to distinguish between the two. But I suppose the answer comes is, what have you imparted on them? A knowledge or skills or anything else? What have they learnt about that skill that you're doing? And I think the task completion, we have to be really careful there that we're not just ticking boxes. If there's no purpose to it, why are we doing it? And I know, we are obviously restricted by the national curricula, and it is really interesting to see the difference in England and Wales. Now, they're so different, the curricula. And I do worry that the curriculum can become a tick box exercise. And actually, we're not worrying about them learning stuff. We've just got to cover everything. And I think we have to be careful of that, because we only have a finite time with these children, and we need to make every opportunity for learning that we can.
And and I think it's interesting you mentioned the England and the Wales thing there. I spent a large part of my teaching career over in England. I trained in Wales, but moved over there to teach. And there was an idea at the time, and some of this came from lesson observations. Some of it, I think, from people, like Ofsted, wanting to see progress within an hour slot, that there had to be an output from a lesson, like something had to be produced. There had to be something in their book. And I remember at times being told that, in their books, even if you weren't doing any writing, they still had to write the date and the learning objective, because they were so focused on this idea that there was a proof. And I think, is it a bold choice then, or is it a tough choice? You mentioned young teachers, to say, actually, this lesson, nothing's going in the book, maybe.
And I think, that is down to school culture and school policy, isn't it? And I think that stems from a culture of inspection and evidence and accountability. And at the end of the day, who are we doing it for? We're not doing school for Eston or Ofsted. We're doing school for the children. So actually, what's more beneficial for them? And there's so many ways of collecting. If you have to collect evidence, there's so many ways to do it now. You don't need to put it in a book. You've got online apps and photos, videos, things like that. And also your planning. Like, your planning should show what you're going to do anyway. And I find the best way to find out what's gone on in the class is not by looking at the book, it's to ask the children, because they'll tell you. They'll tell you how it went, won't they? And they always will give the brutal opinion. Certainly in primary school, I find they're brutal about their opinion about lessons. And I think we do have to move away from that culture of paper-based accountability. As teachers, we don't write everything down. So why should the children have to write everything down?
No, I find this idea of that task completion, that output, that measurement kind of stakes that we're looking at. That we need to get something done, or a worksheet that needs to be, and again, I'm falling into the phrasing that, there's a worksheet that needs to be completed, somehow raises the level of stress for the teacher, maybe blinding us sometimes. I don't know what you think about that. The pressure on yourself of, I've made this sheet, I need them to do all of the answers on this sheet. You're not doing it yet, Yeah,
it's one of the reasons why I hate worksheets. I think they have their place, but I think sometimes, we can almost we've got to be careful about preempting what we want them to learn, because actually we don't always know how a lesson's going to go, and making it more open-ended almost gets rid of that stress. If we are going to make it more open-ended, providing them with tools and scaffolding they need to do tasks. But worksheets can be limiting for the children, but as you said, it can be stressful for the teacher.
Now, you've already touched on another aspect that I wanted to unpick about the work itself, the task design. We've talked a little bit about worksheets and maybe that openness or the pressure of having to get something in books. But one of the possible barriers suggested from that list that we discussed a little bit earlier was by Twitter user Mr. ICT, Mr. P. He's famous. Google him. You'll find him. I got his username wrong there, but I don't know why. But he said purpose should be on the list, and you've already mentioned purpose and them understanding it as part of that kind of understanding the outcome. Does it help to have a purpose?
Well, I would ask teachers. I would go, right, I'm going to come into your school and I'm going to do staff training. If I don't start off with the purpose and the reason behind that, you'll switch off straight away, because you'll be like, I got loads to do. If you don't tell me why I'm sat here doing these things, I'm not going to pay attention and do it. And yet we expect children just to go along with everything we say. As adults, we don't. If we don't really care about something because we don't see the point in it, we don't put full effort into it. We wouldn't. It's actually absolute human nature. And at the end of the day, children are little humans. And I think if we don't share the purpose behind it, then they're going to switch off as well, because they don't see the point. They're just going to be, yeah, right, well, I'll just do what I have to do and that's it. And purpose, I think, sometimes we think of purpose as it has to be sharing with someone or something like that. But it can be as simple as, right, we need to look at, I don't know, making numbers 10 times bigger and smaller, because next week we're going to be looking at converting units of measurement for this project. A purpose can be just linking to other learning, but those children then get why they're doing that activity. And then we're all the same. We want to know why we're doing stuff, because we're all busy and we all want to make sure that what we're doing has got a point to it.
I find that really interesting. There's a part you pulled out there, I want to ask about sort of a little bit more about that, having to share it with people, which I was never a fan of. I think as motivating me as a young learner, I probably didn't want to. If you told me that my work was being, I had to write this letter because I was sending it to, a local MP or something, actually, I think that would make me freeze up even more. But also, and this is kind of maybe more of a primary thing than we see at secondary, but sometimes because we have to have a purpose, primary schools make up a purpose or a fake purpose.
Yeah.
Or, so where do you see that sitting? Because for me, I don't mind it in the younger years, a fake purpose, like Goldilocks might come in and knock over their classroom. But when we're forcing the purpose, and maybe that's the right word rather than fake purpose, is that going to actually motivating for them, or are we tricking ourselves?
Yeah, and I think that's it. And I've struggled with this myself in my classroom over the years. I'm sure lots of people have, when particularly, I think there's no problem, as you said, like a Goldilocks purpose, laughing about it to children. Those children know it's not real. And I'd argue, is that a purpose? I'm not really sure if it is a false purpose or a forced purpose. Is it actually a purpose? But I often, if I do letter writing, for example, I'll say to the children, I'm going to choose one or two to send, because, say, for example, writing to an MP, she's not going to read, the local MP is not going to read 30. And some children that relaxes them because they know that, as you said, theirs aren't going to go. But the other children will then, who are into it, will actually work really hard to try and get it sent. And I don't think I've never seen anyone who's cracked this properly, because I think to come up with an authentic purpose for every single lesson you do, I don't think is possible. Because otherwise you'd be sending things off left, right and centre to everyone.
And another thing you mentioned there, that I wanted to pick up on was you talked about almost like the purpose being part of the learning journey itself. The purpose is the learning is the purpose. The goal here is to get better at something. When you're framing learning, then do you frame it for the learners that the purpose is the journey, the purpose is to get better at it, as opposed to, and I'm trying to think of a way to word this in that same vein as, completing a worksheet because we've got to complete the task, compared to learning. Is that what we're looking for in a purpose then?
I think you just got to do what works for the individual thing. I think we like in education to put lots of rules about how we should do things. But actually, I think if we empower our teachers to use their professional judgment, they can use their judgment about, this week it is going to be a genuine purpose where we're actually going to send it to someone, or we're going to read our story to someone else. But actually, I think it is just as valid sometimes just to go, you all need to know how to write a letter, because one day you'll be doing a letter of application. We need to learn how to write a letter. That's why we're doing this. I think we need to have that flexibility as teachers, and do what's best for that individual journey.
Now, as we pick apart this idea of maybe the work's the problem, I'm saying getting work out of my class is like pulling teeth. And if you're listening in, and as I say, if you want to join the chat, the text boxes are there. You can text us in live in the Podbean app. You can tweet us at TT Radio Official on Twitter. And you can, of course, follow us on Instagram and all of the other ones. But we're pulling apart the idea of the work. And so you have some work that just needs to be done. Okay, at this point, an assessment piece, maybe it's some shared planning that you've been given, and you've got to do it. And when you look at the task, then, okay, so you've come in, maybe as a deputy head, you've been in to cover a class or something. what are the red flags for you when you're looking at the task itself or the lesson that the children are going to stall or struggle with what you've got in front of you?
I think for me, learning journey, it does not get enough focus. You know, that journey, working backwards, and the way I was your training is start at the end. Right, where do you want to go? Let's build it backwards and have those children being given all of the knowledge, skills, tools, and confidence that they need to be able to do the last task. And I think where I see it going wrong at the very beginning is where the teacher has worked from the beginning to the end, and actually some of those lessons are totally irrelevant. They don't matter. You could take them out and they'd still produce the same thing at the end. And I that's how I generally write my writing journey, is I look at every single lesson and go, if I took this lesson out, would their writing be any worse? If the answer is no, it wouldn't change, take the lesson out. Don't do it. Because if you don't see the point of doing it, the children won't either. And so something I look at straight away is, does that teacher know where they're going with this? So they've got a clear idea of where they're going to the end product.
And so, when we talk about that, we're talking about this learning journey as a whole. And is it that then, when we hit these stalling moments, that we haven't thought about a sort of a progression of steps? Is it supposed to be sort of incremental for you, that you can do this little bit, now we're doing it a little bit harder? How incrementally do you build your lessons? Or you said you already don't like a cold right.
Yeah, I despise a cold right, simply because I think it penalises so many children who don't have life experiences. I absolutely understand the need to assess where they actually are. But if you think of, for example, how we write in real life, like, for example, when you emailed me, you don't just sit down and not think about it at all and then just write. You think about it, you might make some notes, or you go back to it, you edit it, and things like that. And so my worry about a complete cold right with no input, no stimulus, no support, is that it's not reflective of real life writing. So like what I like to do is something, say for instance, I need to do a cold, an assessment piece. We'll do some drama around it first. We'll talk about it. So they've got those ideas. But once they write, they're on their own. I'm not going to give them word mats or sentence starters or anything, because I need to know where they are. But I think adding that context at the beginning can help them. And it can help them picture in their head actually where they're going as well. That journey of learning is so important.
And I'm guessing then you would advise this across sort of all subjects, across designing technologies we've mentioned before, across, art. You're starting with those kind of incremental skills, exploring, understanding, seeing examples before going into it yourself.
And I think because, again, it's reflecting real life. And if, for example, us learning Welsh, you don't go to the most complex sentences straight away. You start incrementally with small everyday sentences, with everyday vocabulary, and you gradually build up, because there's so much research out there about memory, and you don't remember things straight away. You have to keep revisiting. And also your brain makes connections between things. We have to make those connections. So actually my lesson 3 should connect to lesson 2 and 1, but should also connect to the lessons afterwards, because that's how your brain learns. Children are exactly the same. They make connections between things that they know. And so we've got to think through that really carefully.
So, we've talked about the work. If I'm saying getting work out of my class is like pulling teeth. When I've sort of staged our questions to think about the work and the class, we've talked a lot about the work. Do you think that, would you be looking first at the work, or would you be looking first at the learners, if someone raised that as a problem for you?
Learners immediately, because to me, they tell you everything. They tell you whether they're engaged, they tell you whether they understand, because sometimes when you look at the work, you don't really know what input, what support, what scaffolding they've had. You find that stuff out by talking to the children, how they found it, and you can ask them questions about it. And I generally do them both at the same time, really. I like to talk to children with their work, because I think that's easier for them as well, isn't it? If they've got the work in front of them, they can refer to it. But it's them I want to know about, because at the end of the day, the books aren't the things that are learning. The books are a tool to learn, or the piece of work, or something you've built. It's the child that we need to look at to find out, actually, are these lessons successful?
So you're possibly suggesting then that, myself as a teacher, so, I've had a terrible lesson today where
Mm.
they just couldn't put pen to paper. They didn't understand it. But potentially then I could go into school tomorrow and sit with the child and just
Mm.
talk to them about it.
Oh my God, I've done it, and they're hilarious what they come up with. And it takes a lot of confidence, and I absolutely understand people new to teaching, and some people experienced teachers might find it difficult because you don't know what they're going to come out with. But if you don't know what's gone wrong with it, why not ask the kids? If say for example an employee wasn't working, the first thing that you do is talk to them. That's what we do, isn't it? If someone can't do something, we talk to them to find out more. Let's do that to the children. And actually, how much agency does that give the children? Because if they're having a direct input into the teaching in their classroom, I think that's really powerful.
Since we're talking about the young people that we're working with at the moment, it's a good point for us to sort of transition from the work itself to the class and thinking about the class. And one of the things I was conscious of when framing this sort of question or phrase of getting work out of my class is like pulling teeth. Is it is negative towards the class, certainly, and we're all allowed to gripe. We're all allowed to, have our moments, in the staff room where we can have a gripe and a whinge and everything. But I wanted to ask you about sort of classroom culture and some of those things, and whether that can affect when we're thinking about the class. Can that affect sort of the work output, for want of a better word?
Oh, definitely. And I think I'm sure we've all seen it where a class transitions to a new teacher and perhaps they were incredibly successful the year before and suddenly this class aren't doing work, or the other way around. You've got a class who haven't been producing the work you'd expect, and then all of a sudden they've got a new teacher and they are. And classroom culture is so important. It's that, and because you have this overall school culture, but every teacher is responsible for their culture in their classroom and the children's attitudes towards their learning. I think it's so important, and it really can make the difference between some children. You'll have some children who will always do the work. You'll have children who have a work ethic that they will always do it. But if you've got borderline children and your culture in a classroom isn't right, it's when it can tip them over the edge to go, I'm not doing that.
So, when you talk about sort of classroom culture, when in your head, because I think this can sometimes go two ways, because some people might be hearing that and sort of thinking, right, it's, a disciplined culture of, you get it done. Or are we talking about a supportive culture of mistakes are okay?
I think, yeah, absolutely. Mistakes, we all make mistakes. And I remember being an NQT thinking I had to be perfect at everything. And I'll never forget one of my first lessons I taught, and I was doing Welsh and I was teaching the seasons and I did the wrong months. And I was so terrified about it when I realised afterwards that I'd put the wrong months into the seasons in Welsh because I hadn't learnt the thing properly. Actually, I didn't know what to do because I was like, I've done that lesson now. And then one of my more senior teachers in school said, just tell him, laugh about them, joke with them. And I was terrified. I was really scared about telling them. And I went in the next day, I went, right, remember that task we did yesterday? So we did that all wrong. And the class just erupted into laughter. And we did it again. And that was a returning point in my career. It was going, actually, let's laugh about our mistakes. If I put a model text on the board and I made a mistake, I say to them, right, find the mistake. Come on, I've done it again. Because we are all fallible, and children shouldn't see you as these perfect beings, because that doesn't give a model for learning themselves. They need to understand that making mistakes is fine. We all do it.
And one of the other things I wanted to ask you about, and I guess this is quite a big question of in itself, was about sort of what motivates those pupils to learn, and so do the work, and whether they need to be motivated by us or whether they need to have that already. How do you see motivating students, pupils as working?
And I think this is where, what do we mean by motivation? I think it can be very easily confused with just getting them to complete the work. And one of my pet hates is when, for example, you have a child who's reluctant to work and you're doing things like a reward chart, I don't know, where they get sweets at the end. That's not motivation, that's bribery. And I can see why people do it. But actually what we're not unpicking there is, why isn't the child started in in the first place, because the motivation needs to come from inside. It needs to come from you. I think we can encourage them and give them the tools as much as possible, but that motivation has to come from them. They have to want to learn and want to do it. And so what we need to do is look at them as little individuals, work out what their barriers are, look at our learning journey, our purpose, and the excitement around that learning. We can create all those conditions so that they can motivate themselves.
And you talk about the unique individuals there. So we've got specific pupils within them, and I know I've already sort of been picked up on the phrasing of the question that my whole class aren't doing the work. But are there going to be groups of or individuals who we need to be more aware of when getting started with their work?
Yeah, I think we're becoming more and more aware, particularly of neurodiversity. So my son has got ADD, and is one of the classic cases of doesn't want to do work because he's very much on his own agenda. And it's that, and I remember there was a time when he was blackmailed by a bribe by food. Sweets were given at the end of the day for do your work. But his engagement and motivation didn't improve over time, because all he did then was going, actually, I'm not only going to do the work if I get sweets at the end. And so we need to look at neurodiversity, children with ADD, ADHD, ASD, all of these neurodiverse things. Those groups are very vulnerable to change. And we need to really know them really well, know your children in depth. And I always say that to new teachers, you've got to know these children more. And then, of course, you've got other children who have maybe are looked after, or there's domestic violence, and actually they don't want to be in school because they're worried about what's going on at home while they're not there. These poor kids, it's like us going to work, isn't it? If you have a relationship breakdown, something awful happens at home, you don't focus in the day properly. And so children are exactly the same. We need to keep an eye. And I think the other ones that often are forgot about is our high achievers. I really do think that they're often forgotten about, because actually for them, what is their motivation for learning? And actually, are they pushing themselves? Are they motivated to do the bare minimum, or are they motivated to actually challenge themselves? And I think we need to look at them all. I think it's a big ask, but I think particularly those vulnerable and those more ables are the ones where we've got to be very careful about that, how we motivate them and what their motivation is.
We've talked a little bit about how we see it as sort of writing, particularly we might see, or output that is in a written format that we might see some of this going, because I've sort of mentioned that I think it applies to artistic work as well. Do you think there is anything that can be done to jumpstart? How do we get that first mark on the page?
And I think don't. It's not about getting the mark on the page. I think for me, if I've had these children over the years, and the first thing is getting to know that child. Actually, if they've got incredibly complex issues going on and they've come to school and they're sat down, that's step one. Let's do that. Let's get to know them, and then getting to know them so you can work out what are their barriers. And actually, rather than tackling the end product, what we need to do is tackle the other things first. So, we talked earlier about grammar and spelling was an interesting one. A child may have, for example, dyslexia, who's terrified of putting pen to paper. So we don't tackle the writing. What we do is give them the strategies they need to, one, maybe improve their spellings, but also to realise it's not the end of the world if you make a mistake. Let's tackle that. And actually putting pen to paper should come on its own, because they won't be afraid anymore. So I think, be careful about going straight to the end product.
Fantastic. Now, we are going to stop now for the news. When we come back, we're going to continue unpicking this. We'll see you all on the other side. Now, Ian, I should just double check. Do you know how to mute yourself?
Do you know what? I don't, and I feel really bad because my username for some reason is RQFPUGRB, because I did not realise that it wasn't registered on the app.
That happens all of the time, and I have to preemptively. So when you first joined, there is like a kind of nervousness in me going, I think it is. I've let someone in. It's like letting someone in who's wearing their hood zipped up and their hat pulled down, and coming in with a different username. Don't worry. What I can do is I can mute you from my end, and you're happy to stick around through the news, and we'll see you on the other side, because there's lots more questions I want to ask. Okay?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nathan.
We'll see you on the other side of the news, guys.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncatbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The Christian Institute website carries a story on the reminder by Minister of State for Schools Nick Gibb that schools in England have a duty to remain politically impartial in their teaching and extracurricular activities. The guidance was published last year, but Mr Gibb was responding to MP Miriam Cates' references to a YouGov poll, which appears to reveal that the majority of UK children are being taught political ideology as fact, and he issued the reminder. Ms Cates was referencing a view that children are being taught that they can be born in the wrong body, as well as resources being used in schools which focus on the topic of gender identity. The DfE guidance comes as Scotland attempts to introduce new legislation on gender recognition, which is opposed by Westminster. The guidance states that schools should not under any circumstances work with or use materials produced by external agencies that take extreme political positions. The Varsity website reports on findings by a right-wing think tank that elite universities were more likely to use progressive terminology on their websites. Cambridge tops the table in the Radical Progressive University Guide, although the think tank Civitas does not appear to see this as a positive. Varsity highlights comments reported in the Daily Mail, which warned that half of our universities peddle their woke agenda to students. The think tank generated the findings after exploring university websites and news reports, looking for a series of key phrases including trigger warning, white privilege, and anti-racism. Those with high incidences of key phrases were at the top of the table. Varsity acknowledges a view that Cambridge's political culture is to the left of the national one, but also highlights key figures in academia who feature prominently in the conservative press. It's hard to stay away from politics as announcements of strikes continued late last week. The TES reports on the continued deadlock in Scotland, whilst the Evening Standard covers talks between ministers and unions in England after the NEU confirmed strike dates for the coming weeks and months. These strikes are set to impact schools in England and Wales, although the BBC further reports on talks in Wales. Its news website reports that teachers and school leaders have been offered a one-off payment by the Welsh Government, similar to that offered to health workers, although unions have already said that the offer is not enough. Scottish media outlets have also carried a story about what it describes as fears about violence in schools. A clip now widely shared on social media shows an altercation between two students and that took place on the same day a male pupil was left unconscious following an assault. Whilst Police Scotland have said it's investigating both incidents, it has sparked debate on the state of behaviour in schools, particularly as such incidents have featured in headlines before. The Scottish Government has previously stated they're investing an additional £15 million this year to enhance capacity, to effectively meet the needs of young people, and that they were very clear that violence is unacceptable. In further political news, the petition put forward by three men known as the Three Dads Walking will go to Parliament. The men, who all lost daughters to suicide, want to get suicide prevention on the school curriculum. The petition they set up now has more than 155,000 signatures, which means that it will be discussed in Parliament, after previously failing to be heard. Finally, more than 20,000 defibrillators will be sent to almost 18,000 state-funded schools by the end of the academic year. It comes after the government committed to ensuring there was a device in every school last year. The rollout comes after campaigning from the Oliver King Foundation and its founder Mark King, whose son died at 12 from a cardiac arrest while swimming at school. Guidance to support schools has been created, including awareness videos. and Education Secretary Gillian Keegan praised the work of the Oliver King Foundation and described the rollout as a huge milestone. Mr. King stated, "Defibrillators save lives," and that he hoped that families do not have to suffer the heartbreak of unnecessarily losing a child. This is for our Ollie. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, a while ago I asked you what is your go-to piece of tech. This week I had the pleasure of talking to Ian Kenyon, CEO of Wirral Respite and Alternative Provision, also known as WRAP for short. So, Ian, what is your go-to piece of tech in your setting?
Thanks, Steve. In our organisation, we are absolutely embedded in sharing our information and our data via the cloud. And there's loads of software out there to do it. And there's a lot of bespoke software for our type of organisation, student information management services, the likes of SIMS or Arbor or things like that. But unfortunately, they're all built around big organisations, big schools, schools with up to 1,200 students. Certainly not for schools that have a turnaround of students who are completing courses in 12 weeks, and those students who are potentially returning but require new files. We've tried proprietary software. It's very, very expensive. But actually what we've fallen back to is what Google provides. Using G Suite, which is now Google Workplace, we have access to spreadsheets, to form filling software for data collection, Google Docs, which is, you're very familiar with everything via traditional Microsoft Offices. Being able to link docs and sheets and forms together has been almost transformational for our organisation. It's not the cheapest, I will say. The per user price matches what other software like Zoho or Microsoft will do, but offers a simpler version for us, and offers us some interactivity that we've never had before. It handles our email, it handles our student information, so gathering attendance, it handles our finance, so invoicing. The way that the suite works, the way that the package works, just works really well for us, but with very little additional investment in time, effort and training. Google offers us everything that we need. The final sort of element that has been transformational for us is then being able to use proprietary hardware such as Chromebooks or even Android phones, and the ability for us to then transfer our data and to be live in the cloud at all times has been a really good thing for our organisation. So there you have it. My number one go-to, it's definitely got to be Google Workplace.
Thank you, Ian. As always, I'd love to hear what you want to know about tech. Do you have a go-to piece of tech? Let us know at TT Radio Official. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio. Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Borodar Pab, Croeso i Abertawe. Hello everyone, welcome to Swansea. Welcome to the Twilight Show with me, Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tonight I'm joined by Ian Timbrell, he's teacher, deputy head and consultant. We're talking about getting them to start, what to do when they just won't work. We've started with this phrase of, getting work out of my class is like pulling teeth. We've discussed a lot of things. We've discussed about the task design, the learning journey design. We've discussed the students in particular, their motivation. We've talked about some of the barriers that they might have personally to their learning that stops them at that moment of getting started with a task, which is how I frame this, although we've moved on to talking about learning in general. Now, I'm just going to check Ian's back with us. Ian, you still there?
Yep, they're here.
Fantastic. Yeah, always a bit of a panic for me after the news. I like to, just check that, have they gone? Are they still off making a cup of tea? I don't know, have we still got them with us? So one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and you've kind of touched on, is, young people being a little bit like, like little adults, little human beings. And I wanted to pull something from an adult kind of place about obstacles to productivity, as they call it. When we think in the workplace, maybe you're sat at your computer to plan some lessons. We'd be talking about productivity. And for our young people, it's sat in their workspaces, about to start some learning. We can see maybe some links and some barriers. So this is linked on an article put out by psychologytoday.com, an American organization, who are talking about obstacles to productivity for adults. And I kind of wanted to use it as a mirror or a lens for us to reflect on our pupils. And it starts with an interesting kind of phrase, and I'm going to read that out. It says, in a culture that glorifies hyper productivity and always being on, feeling unproductive, even temporarily, can trigger intense anxiety, stress, or shame. So the question I wanted to ask on the base of that is, do you think us as teachers, and that we're putting on to maybe our students through our lessons, that we're too focused on whether that be output or progress or measurable learning in lesson time?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I think, I remember starting teaching, the accountability that we have in many areas now promotes that, of we have to get so much out of these poor children. And we know that, across the country, that children coming into schools are now a lower literacy and numeracy rate than ever been, and yet we're expected to get them to the same place at the end. And I think schools can quickly fall into the trap of, that means I've got to do more stuff. And for some children, if not all, it's exhausting. And I know, like, I read a really good article a while ago about ADHD children, and when she picks her daughter up from school, they sit in silence for the car journey and they're not allowed to talk about school. And I tried it with my son, and it was really interesting how he would just sit there silently, because he was obviously exhausted from the day. And then when he wanted to, then he would tell me about his day, whereas what I used to do was interrogate him about his day, but he needed time to process that. And I do wonder, in school day, are we giving them time to process what they've done? Are we giving them time to relax? Are we giving them time to actually sort of get rid of that anxiety and stress? Or are we on this total hamster wheel where these poor children are churning out thing after thing after thing?
And I think it is interesting. We're talking sort of both of us somewhat from a Welsh perspective, although, I have recently, my son, who has started school here in Wales, and myself as a primary school teacher in England for most of my career, where there is maybe even more pressure, I would say, at lower ages, younger down in the school. So my son, currently in year 1, and in my head as a teacher, because I should know where he should be, and in fact, people will say those phrases to me about knowing where he should be. But I'm thinking, phonics check. I've got all of these sounds that he has to know all of them, because he has to get. He has to get a certain pass score to be on track. So I have to cram these things into him, and I had a real struggle at the start with that mentality, both as a parent, but also in a different educational system now, where I was, trying to force that learning into him. And I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think homework is, to be honest, homework is one of my biggest bugbears. I think it should be banned in primary schools, because study after study shows it doesn't work. It doesn't add impact. And actually, when I come home, I want to spend quality time with my son. I've been working all day as well. I want to be enjoying. They're only children once. I mean, he's 9, mine is now. He's coming to that age where he's not going to want to know me in a couple of years. And so actually, I want to enjoy the time I've got with him. I don't want to be sitting doing spelling sheets and things like that. And so many studies show it doesn't work anyway. But I absolutely agree. I mean, England and Wales have very different accountability systems, and it's going to be interesting in a couple of years to see how it changes. We don't have SATs here at all. There's no national data collected at all anymore. The onus is very much on the school. So it's very, very different to England, where, with all of the grammar and SPAG tests and all that, the amount of accountability in England has gone up, I'd say, in the last 10 years. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but whereas Wales, it's gone down. And I do find that it'll be interesting to look in another 10 years' time and see where we are.
Well, one of the things that really interests me about that at the moment, and you might know more about this than me, or have opinions on it, is the idea of reading ages. I was looking into at the moment, and there is a suggestion that because obviously people will ask me, particularly about my son, like his reading, and I read with him every night, but is he doing all right? So in my head, I know that in the English system, potentially I would be worried as a teacher, or I would be trying to put things in place to force that progress on. I would be saying things or doing interventions at school and forcing them on. Now, when I'm not so worried here, and his teachers tell me that it is fine. The journey he is on, that's the right journey for him, and it's not to worry about. So my question would be, on this split somewhat between England and Wales, is it possible for us to have reading ages in that sense? Because potentially my child is on a very different journey to the one that he would be on in England.
And reading ages are really interesting, and you have to be incredibly careful with reading ages, because actually, what do reading ages test? There is no test to measure reading comprehensively. Even Crispin Chatterton, who's the director of GL Assessment, said that actually you shouldn't be using them in isolation because they only tell you a certain part. We can't test certain areas of reading. It's so difficult to test inference and deduction and prediction and things like that. I think we have to be very careful with all of these data, that we really understand what the purpose of it is. We should also be talking to the children about their reading and reading with them and getting a rounded picture. It does make it difficult when they're transferring schools. I think that's the biggest thing. Particularly I wonder now, say for instance, a child moves into England from Wales, they're not necessarily going to have data going with them. It'll be very narrative unless that school has done tests themselves. So I do think, it's going to be, when those moves start to happen, which they're going to more and more, actually, how will schools be able to track progress and be able to know where that child is straight away?
Yeah, I find it really interesting because potentially, we could be looking at the same thing with countries, such as Finland, for example, where they start school later. How does those parts interest me about, where we start putting pressure on, where we start panicking about output and work and all of those things, because they can happen depending on the culture that you're in, the education system. They could be at different points, and certainly in England there has been a shift that pressure and that stress about getting through all of the learning for a defined national testing point is certainly higher, I would say.
Definitely. And I do think we need to be careful about comparing to countries like Finland. So I was part of a group that helped design the new Welsh curriculum, and we looked at the research, and it's wonderful. The children start at 7. What people don't really, what they don't often talk about is the fact that, yes, they don't start school till 7, but when they start school, generally most children can read and write because they're taught at home, because that is the culture of Finland. And so, but we don't necessarily have that culture. Certainly schools that I've worked in the past, those children would come to school at age 7 not being able to read or write, possibly at all. When we do look at other countries, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, because it's not the same place. It's not the same culture. Our whole parental attitudes would have to change if we were to say start school at 7. It couldn't just be, oh, great, they'll start at 7 now, they're going to be better learners, because that's not our culture.
Yeah. Now, another thing that came up in this article, and I should say for our listeners, because we delving deep into some of these things, we're talking about comparing an article from psychologytoday.com about obstacles to productivity, but throwing that through a lens of, how that would look for students in school. Another thing that they come up with is procrastination. Now, do you think students in school are procrastinating? If they are, what are they putting off? And why?
I think we all are, aren't we? We all have a bit of procrastination. Because I left school, just before Christmas, and I was like, I can't start doing my work yet because my office isn't done. I could. I had a table, but I had to do my office first. But then IKEA didn't have the furniture I needed, so I then had to wait until that was done. And then I had to organise it. Honestly, I came up with so many reasons not to start work. And I think children are exactly the same. Children are very savvy, and they will do anything they can do generally to delay the start of tasks. And it's totally normal. Again, you know, they're little people, and if they can delay doing something they don't want to do, of course they're going to do it. That might be going to the toilet, that might be asking a question, that might be just staring at you until you tell them to start working. And I think, you know, it's about just realising that they are people at the end of the day, and procrastination is something that comes to us all naturally. There is no one who doesn't procrastinate with certain things, and we have to accept that in children as well.
Do you think that ties into maybe the pieces that you said there about kind of the pressure, the assessment, and those things, that we don't have time to accept the normality of not being 100% all of the time in every single lesson? And I think, you know, I would say that from secondary. I don't think it's the same in primary, because you maybe have more breathing space to have ups and downs. But I imagine a secondary school now, particularly in some schools, where you have to be, you know, you walk into the class, and from that second, the teacher's been told, so do it now task. You've got to get the books out as quickly as possible. Learning, go to the bell. You know, you've got to teach all of that time. But to do that 5 hours a day must be incredibly hard.
Well, you know, and we are in a critical time in education. We've got a huge retention crisis. We've got, you know, so many teachers' mental health problems, and it's no wonder, in some sort, I can only imagine. And I think schools can go into panic mode. You know, your levels are down 1 year, so everyone's got to work harder. Whereas actually, rather than doing that, unpick why they went down. What was the reason behind it? Doing more work isn't necessarily going to make things better, because if the learning isn't right first, doing more ineffective learning isn't going to make the learning better. So I think we need to very much, it's the why question. Why, you know, and then we need to learn about learning. And actually, loads of learning shows it's not about doing more, it's about doing things well, making them more effective, making those links. That's what gets going to get better results, is by the learning being better, not by more.
Now, you know, on that kind of vein of procrastination, of efficiency, time saving, and productivity, we hear a lot. One of the things that they mention in this article is about meaningless tasks that people are doing. Now, I would say I see this a lot. You know, I see a lot of people doing different things that are meaningless, you know, whether that be sharpening a pencil or whatever, to procrastinate or fill time. Do you see that in schools? And based on what you said there, is that a bad thing? Do we need to address it?
I think let's just be sensible about it. You know, there was a pupil I had in my class last year who was expert at this. Somehow their pencil was always blunt. Their pen had always run out, and they never had a ruler, ever. And whether they were doing it consciously or subconsciously, I didn't mind. So we got into the routine where at the beginning of the lesson, it would always be a thing of they'd have to get a new pencil, new pen, and everything like that. But actually, this child had so much stuff going on in their life, I couldn't blame them. And actually, I'm going to pick my battles. The fact that after you did all your procrastination, you still sat down and did your task, and you did it well, that's what matters. I'm not worried about it. You know, we all procrastinate. Before you could do planning, I bet you're making a cup of tea, even though you might not need one, or you move things around, or you tidy up. Procrastination is absolutely normal. And sometimes, actually, I feel it can be a release. It's not just about delaying work. It's just about regulating yourself before you start, getting your area ready, doing those little things that actually regulate you ready. So when you come to do the task, you're actually ready to do them. Well, you know, if we start, like that child, for example, if I started the lesson by telling him off again for losing his pencil or his pencil being blunt, it's such a negative start to the lesson. He's not going to do well in it. So let him crack on and procrastinate. As long as he gets to his task, that's what matters.
Yeah, I would say, you know, I think you know, when you're talking about that, I'm thinking about those lessons that I've seen or even had myself, where actually, you know, kind of highlighting and putting pressure on. Say, come on. That doesn't make. I've never known that make anyone move faster. That almost always makes them move slower.
Yeah. Yeah, they'll find something else. I mean, for those who have got children, I think children are so great at bedtime, aren't they? They're experts at it. They and if you, certainly my son is, if I tell him to do something, it gets slower. I think, yeah, just let's pick our battles. Actually, what is the priority here? Is the priority that they start within 30 seconds, or is the priority actually that they just get it done by the end? Let's be realistic here, because it'll save you a lot of stress as well.
Now, this next one, and it maybe give us an insight into when you were, had a classroom of your own in the primary school, whether you had tables in groups or in rows, because the next one, the Psychology Today article comes up with for adults about obstacles for productivity, was about how can I cope with distracting co-workers. So in our version then, distracting classmates could be an issue. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. We all know that person that we shouldn't sit next to in the staff room when there's a staff meeting, because you'll be gossiping and not actually paying attention. Children are exactly the same. And I believe that we should be very honest with children about it. Right. You can't sit next to them. You know why, don't you? Come on, let's talk it through. And I have moved children and had that conversation. I'd be like, right, I can't sit next to Mr. James, because do you know what? In the staff meeting, we're going to be chatting, and we're going to be chatting rubbish, not listening to Mrs. Jones. So, we all have people we shouldn't sit next to. You'll get to see them at break anyway. And I think that's, again, a part of life, and it's a lesson for them to learn. Let's not avoid that conversation, because they need to learn that, because, one day they're going to be choosing their own seats in secondary, and they need to learn that actually sometimes it's better not to sit next to someone. And I do find the desks and rows interesting. Like, are your tables in rows or desks or groups?
Mine currently, and so, well, you see, I'm in a unique situation in the sense that because I'm in an alternative provision, my class maybe has 10 kids in it. And so they are all at individual desks, but with a gap between them, and they get one desk each, but it's a double-sized desk, and then they are all facing forward. But there is interaction with them. That's more about having your own personal space is the choice behind that, I would say. Sometimes we do put them together and work in group tables. When I was in primary, though, with we're talking a class of 30, I did move between the typical primary model of that kind of 3 desks where you can sit 6 kids, that kind of ladybird type layout, where you have the 3 desks with one on the end turned the other way, so 2 and then 1 on the end. And I tried rows. But my worry is, and I don't know if I fell into this, is, this efficiency saving model of, you can't talk because we have to get through everything that we have to get through, and there is pressure and we have to get through it. And my real worry about that is whether that's good for the young people's mental health, first of all, and sort of harking on something you said about this time to process and absorb and to think and to go back to it. And when we talk about sharpening pencils, I don't mind that in an art lesson. Because, to get up, to think about it, get up, sharpen a pencil. I do that at work. I go and get myself a cup of tea and sit back down, and it's processing time for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we all just have to use our judgment. When a child is taking advantage of that, then yes, a conversation has to be had. But, to be creative takes time. And I think sometimes we talk about creativity in the sense of like art, music, drama, things like that. But you can be creative in maths. To problem solving is a form of creativity, and we need to give that children that thinking space. Now, I'm very much, I do my thinking out loud, so I need someone to talk to. But other people do their thinking by silence and inward reflection. And I think we need to give opportunities for both of those things in our classroom, so all children get that opportunity to process and to develop that creativity in everything we do, not just in the arts.
The final one then, and this kind of brings us full loop back of these obstacles to adult productivity. And so we, as we translate them down, was something said in the article about how can I manage competing priorities? And for me, when I read this, I was thinking, like we discussed sort of right at the beginning of this, about writing and, whether they're focusing on their grammar and spelling. And you mentioned there that it was a surprise to you sort of earlier on in the show that children would focus on that or found it hard to ignore that. But writing itself is a complex task, particularly in primary when you're even learning to hold the pen, learning to shape the letters. There's a lot going on for people. Is the burden too much sometimes then? And that's what's stopping them.
Yeah, I think sometimes we look at the minutiae of things too much. Drives me nuts when people talk about correct grammar, because there is no such thing as correct grammar, because grammar is evolving constantly. What it is we have formal grammar, but even that's changing constantly. What is the important thing in this task at the end of the day? If we're writing a story, for example, you cannot focus on everything. You can't. I see some of these tick lists that people have for success criteria, and there's like 10 things on there, and I'm like, those poor children must be thinking about so many things that actually they're not thinking about what is the thing that they need to do. What's the focus here? And those competing, as you said, those competing priorities. What is the priority for this task? Do you know what? If they've spelt some words wrong, it's no big issue. They can go back. That's what editing days are for. That's what corrections are for. What actually, if we give too many priorities, I think they can be so diluted that they're not going to make the progress. And how on earth would you assess them? That's what I always wonder afterwards as well. How do you know whether they've made progress in 10 different areas? And I can only imagine sort of in your context, but actually certain things are not priorities because those kids have got a lot going on, haven't they?
Mm. Hey, some days for me, progress is them holding a door for someone. Some days, progress is them making a cup of tea for a member of staff, and that multifaceted. Unfortunately, my learning journeys are somewhat weird and hard to explain. Unfortunately, to people, I had a child today who gave a member of staff a high five. And when I told other staff about that, this was the biggest uproar. It was probably on par for us with finding out that, you're teaching a mainstream class and a kid had got an A star in their GCSEs. We were all just like, it's the best day ever. And some of those things, and I know you talked about it earlier about, young people sometimes being in the learning environment is the priority. And so, managing those priorities. But I wanted to ask you about, we've talked a bit there about teachers putting it on, but can sometimes the children put that on themselves? Because I've certainly, and this is in primary, known of, an example where, for instance, there was a young girl who was spending so much time concentrating on making her handwriting beautiful that it was slowing the thought process and the flow of everything. So can sometimes the children be putting on themselves in that sense? And what can we do about that?
Definitely, and I think we are learning more and more, because then when we think about sort of mental health of children, we tend to think of those that are, in care, for example, or have got things like domestic violence going at home. But actually, what about the mental health of our children who are more able and are putting on themselves so much pressure to get everything right and perfect? And I think sometimes they can be a bit forgotten, and we need to look after them just as much. And I think this is my worry about giving lists of success criteria. You can overburden them. For me, like I suffer with quite bad anxiety. That would cause such horrific anxiety for me that I know my writing would be dreadful because I'd be trying to do everything at once. So one of the other jobs I'm doing at the moment is lecturing, and I was talking to some international students about structuring essays and things. And it was amazing. The questions that they were asking were so different. All of them had different priorities. But if I wrote them all on a list and asked them all to do it, their essays would be dreadful because they'd be so stressed about ticking all these boxes that actually the point of the essay would go. So I think we need to be really careful about actually what we're asking for the children.
I would love to show you some of my planning from maybe 2015 in England when I was teaching, because I remember there was a big curriculum change in England at the time. 2014 curriculum, Michael Gove had come in, big shake up, and it's when we got the grammar and the punctuation, and I remember very clearly being told that. And luckily this has changed. Nuance has found its way in, and author's voice has found its way back into writing. But I remember being told that some of the writing wasn't quite good enough. A child who was fantastic should have been greater depth. In fact, under the old regime in Key Stage 1, were greater depth. But I was told that she couldn't be greater depth anymore. In fact, she'd be working towards the expected standard, so below, as in where she should be. So dropped a whole 2 levels because she in a piece of writing hadn't included four-fronted adverbials. And I was kind of like, like, you know, that idea of we're writing and crafting, but you have to hit a criteria as well. Yeah. That really rings with me about the pressure that must be on some of our young people.
Yeah, and my question would be like, well, that child who can obviously use front adverbials, which also front adverbials, because my grammar work is not a thing. It only exists in education. It's not a thing. But also, what if that child felt that front adverbials weren't suitable for that piece of writing? It's their writing. They should be able to choose whatever they want to use in that writing. It's like when I do grammar training, I talk about, right, which is the best sentence, and I give them a short sentence and a complex sentence. And everyone always goes, well, the complex sentence is better. Look, you know, it's got a subordinate clause, it's got a front adverbial, it's got this vocabulary. I'm like, yeah, okay, you're writing a horror story, which is better? Well, actually, short sentences are far better in horror stories because they create atmosphere. And I think we need to be careful about what it does better mean, because it should mean for that individual piece of writing and for that individual as well. And it's that, you mentioned it earlier about that craft of writing, isn't it? It's about teaching them not to tick boxes, but actually how to craft something.
Now we are rapidly approaching sort of the end of the show, and we have whistle stopped across through, you know, all kinds of different things, talking about task design, talking about barriers and motivation and all of those. But if there's someone who's listening and you know, and they are facing this, where they're thinking, do you know what, I have a young person, or I have a class that I teach, or a group within it, where that moment from me saying we're going to do this, and then them starting doing it feels too long for me, or it feels awkward. Mm. What would be your top tips for them to look at first?
I think take the pressure off yourself for one. You're not going to fix this in a day. These things take time, and take a step back, get to know that child, get to know the background of that child, including the background in school, and try to work out what is actually their barrier to writing. The barrier to writing is not them not wanting to put pen to paper. It'll be something else that's causing it. And then try to tackle those background things rather than the task itself. But don't beat yourself up about it. These things take time. As long as you're trying, that's the most important thing.
Fantastic. Now, thank you so much for coming on with us tonight, giving up your time to come on and kind of share your thoughts on here on Teachers Talk Radio. I should say, if you've just joined us live in the studio as we're wrapping up, this will be available as a podcast afterwards, either at ttradio.org/listenback, where you can use the search feature to search any. I think we're at 1,500 episodes. You can sort of search any of our past episodes and find anything. So you could type in there grammar, you could type in their motivation, and it would pull up all of the episodes. It'll also be on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon. In fact, do you know, I found out the other day you can actually ask your Amazon Alexa, which I won't do now because it will start talking back to me, but you can say to your Amazon, play Teachers Talk Radio. It will play Teachers Talk Radio for you, and you'll be able to do that. But yeah, if people wanted to reach out and find you though, Ian, is there a way that they could do that?
Yeah, the best way is either on my Twitter, which is at iTimbrell, that's TIMBRELL, or you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok now. Actually, I'm on TikTok now. I was 40 this year, but still down with the kids. You can find me on Instagram at Timbrell Education.
Fantastic. And again, thank you so much for being on. Best of luck with the keeping up with the Welsh with your son and partner. I being in a bilingual household must be, challenging at times, particularly when they gang up on you.
And I think it's just going to get worse. So I just need to embrace it. I need to embrace it. It's going to happen.
Just embrace it and pretend you don't know what's going on. Yeah, yeah. Definitely. Just use it to your advantage. Well, thank you so much. And Nostar.
Yeah, Nostar, thank you so much for inviting me on. I've had a great time. Thank you.
You too. Right, and good night, everyone. We'll see you later. Don't forget, there's more shows to come up on Teachers Talk Radio this evening. So come back later. 9:00, we'll have another show up for you. And good night from here in Swansea. Nostar, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.